Good evening, everyone. My name is Lucy and I work at the Mississauga Library, and it's my privilege to host this program this evening. If you're having any technical difficulties, please message Elizabeth, my colleague, in the chat line. We always start these programs with a land acknowledgement, which I'll read. We acknowledge the lands which constitute the present-day city of Mississauga as being part of the treaty and traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Wyandot nations. We recognize these peoples and their ancestors as peoples who inhabited these lands since time immemorial. The city of Mississauga is home to many global Indigenous peoples. As a municipality, the city of Mississauga is actively working towards reconciliation by confronting our past and our present, providing space for Indigenous peoples within their territory to recognize and uphold their treaty rights and to support Indigenous peoples. We formally recognize the Anishinaabe origins of our name and continue to make Mississauga a safe space for all Indigenous peoples. If you're new to WebEx, we just have a little bit of information sharing to do. If you, there's a chat box on the right-hand side with the blue arrow. You can select to message the host or the panelists. You can share your questions and comments during this program using this feature. Also, you can, closed captioning is enabled for this programming. You can turn captioning on or off by clicking on the CC button on the bottom left-hand corner, indicated by the yellow rectangle. Once the captioning is turned on, you're also able to adjust font size or change background color to light or dark by clicking on the three dots at the end of the black bar that appears. The box in the middle with the green arrows is for reactions. You can let us know how you're feeling about what is being shared and feel free to interact. We also like to promote the library's 24/7 digital services. These are free with your library card. You just go to mississaugalibrary.ca. We offer a large collection of ebooks, audiobooks through Libby by Overdrive and Hoopla. Hoopla also offers music, movies, TV shows, and comics. You can access digital magazines through Flipster and RB Digital for magazines. Press Reader has newspapers from all over the world in more than 60 languages. And free and downloadable music is available through Freegal. You can learn a huge selection of languages on Mango Languages, and LinkedIn Learning offers opportunities to learn all kinds of new skills, everything from 3D animation, finance, and even writing skills. Our next Lecture Me program will be on November 1st at 7 p.m., and we will be joined by Omadali Jazi for his talk on COVID-19 pandemic, tracking the global outbreak, statistical modeling, and vaccine efficacy. Now to the main event tonight. I'm going to pass this on to Rima Chakra from UTM to introduce our professor.
Thank you, Lucy. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Rima Chakra from the Experiential Education Unit, Office of the Vice Principal, Academic, and Dean at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. In collaboration with the Mississauga Library System, welcome to our Lecture Me talk featuring Professor Mairi Cowan from the Department of Historical Studies. Professor Cowan is an Associate Professor teaching stream in the Department of Historical Studies and the Institute for the Study of University Pedagogy at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. She is a historian of the late medieval and early modern world and has written books and articles of medieval Scotland, colonial and North America, and how best to teach history at the secondary and post-secondary levels. She is a recipient of several teaching awards, including the E.A. Robinson Teaching Excellence Award, which recognizes excellence in undergraduate teaching at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, the Ontario Confederation of University Faculty Associations Teaching Award, which is given to Ontario's most outstanding university teachers, and the Canadian Historical Association's Excellence in Teaching with Primary Sources Award. Her forthcoming book, titled The Possession of Bart Haley, Diabolical Arts and Daily Life in Early Canada, is published by McGill Queen's University Press. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mairi Cowan. Over to you.
Thank you very much. To begin, Can everyone hear me? Yes, okay. Now I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Can everybody see slides?
Yes.
All good.
Okay, super. Thank you very much. Thank you to the Dean's Office and the Experiential Education Unit at UTM. Thank you also to the Mississauga Library for organizing the Lecture Me series and then for inviting me to be a part of it. Thank you to everyone who has attended this evening. I very much hope you enjoy this talk. Residents in and around the town of Quebec started to report some very strange occurrences during the autumn of 1660. In the sky, they saw a man enveloped in flame and a canoe of fire. In the air, they heard lamentable cries and a thunderous, horrible voice. A newly arrived teenager who was working as a domestic servant at an estate a few kilometers outside the town said that she was being terrified by demons and specters. Those who tried to chase away the malevolent spirits described phantasmal music and stones that detached themselves from walls to fly by themselves. The teenaged servant started to show signs of demonic possession, and she accused a local miller as a witch responsible for her torments. They were both brought into the town of Quebec. The servant was enclosed in the hospital where she was treated by nuns, while the miller was imprisoned. An Ursuline nun wrote that this miller had been using the tricks of his diabolical art to corrupt and then marry the servant. I first came upon this story while on a family holiday in Quebec City. Being maybe a little bit nerdy, I thought it would be fun to have as vacation reading material something written by people who had lived here in the past. So I packed into my bag a book of letters written by a nun named Mairi de l'Incarnation, who lived in Quebec during the 17th century. It was in one of these letters that I first read about the demonic infestation. I was riveted. I wanted to know more about what had happened to the supposedly possessed servant and the accused witch, and I wondered whether fears of witchcraft and demons were more widespread in New France than I had thought. When I could not find answers to my questions right away, I decided to investigate the topic myself. The result is this book. This book, whose official publication date is now 9 days away, so we're in the countdown period. My copy just arrived today, and I hear the Mississauga Library the Mississauga Library has copies on order, so soon you'll be able to order it there or at whatever public library is close to where you live. This book is a microhistory. Microhistory is a historical approach that focuses on small things to ask big questions. It looks up close at a single object of study, in this case, my episode of demonic possession. And then it performs a very close reading of historical sources, situating those sources in a larger historical context. The method of microhistory means that we devote a lot of attention to the details from the past. Then we analyze these details very carefully to learn about the everyday lives of ordinary people and connect these details to larger themes so that we can try to understand not just the details themselves, but something bigger about the wider world. One of the conventions of style in microhistory is to be very transparent about our methods of investigation and the limits to our knowledge. In most microhistory, this means our understanding of the past actually becomes part of the historian's account, such as when I mentioned just a few minutes ago how I came upon the story while on vacation. Another convention of microhistory is that we are supposed to be doing all of this in a very accessible narrative style. So I hope this presentation is not yet too boring for you. What I think microhistory can do very well is to examine the lives and the actions and the thoughts of people who otherwise get left out of historical accounts. The regular folks, people on the margins of society. And then microhistory allows us to take them very seriously as actors worthy of consideration historically in their own right. From this microhistory, we can see that people in 17th century Quebec were very worried about a demonic infestation. And because of that worry, they created documents that tell us a lot about the daily lives of people who might not otherwise have their lives recorded. These documents also help us find deeper meanings and wider significance to people's actions. So this evening, we are going to look at some of the aspects of daily life in early Canada, also the diabolical arts that these people feared, and how people's thoughts and actions were shaped by forces that could extend for hundreds of years and thousands of leagues. We'll start with crossing the Atlantic. Crossing the Atlantic was neither quick nor easy in the 17th century. If all went well for a ship under sail, meaning that if the winds and the currents were favorable, if there were no storms and no attacks by enemy vessels, then the voyage between a port in France and the town of Quebec was expected to take about 2 months. Some voyages took much longer. In fact, one vessel in 1688 was at sea for 129 days. The domestic servant who showed signs of possession was among those who crossed from France to Canada in 1659. Her name was Barbe Allais. She came from a village near the city of Chartres in France, and she made the oceanic crossing with her father, her mother, an older sister, and a younger sister. They were part of a growing wave of French migration, but the French crown was still not able to attract as many people to make the journey as they had hoped. The population of the town of Quebec, which was the largest French settlement in all of New France, was under 800 people at the time. You can see on this plan from 1660 that it was not very big. If you're familiar with Quebec City today, you'll recognize some of its features down here. Let's see if I can get a slightly bigger laser pointer. Down here, this is the lower town on the St. Lawrence River. Here is the steep path that leads into the upper town. This is the Rue Saint-Jean, and this is where the seminary is located today. So that orients you a little bit if you know Quebec City now. Not every dwelling is represented on this plan or on this slightly later plan from 1663, but you do get, I think, a very clear sense of how small the town was. By contrast, Boston in New England had a population of about 2,000 at this time, and Potosi in the Peruvian Andes had reached about 150,000. Quebec City, therefore, very small. One of the reasons why the French crown was having such difficulty attracting migrants to Canada, as they called the French settlements along the St. Lawrence River, was that Canada had a reputation of being a rather difficult place to live. Among the difficulties that Barbe Allais and her family would likely have heard about before leaving France was the difficulty of the weather. French writers wrote a lot about the coldness of winters in Canada. Some of them said a person really had to be here during the winter themselves to understand it, but others did try to explain what the winters were like and why. These explanations point us to a much larger discussion about climate and about early modern European struggles to fit new observations as best they could into ancient categories. French travelers to Canada knew that the town of Quebec was south of Paris, which it is. Quebec City is in fact about 120 kilometers south of Paris, France. With French settlement on the St. Lawrence being at roughly the same latitude as in France, French travelers thought the two regions should have roughly the same temperatures. This way of thinking was an inheritance from ancient Mediterranean geographers, most often represented by Ptolemy. Within this system, as it came to be understood by early modern Europeans, there were several bands of hot and cold wrapped around the world. At each of the poles, the south and the north, there was a frigid zone. In the tropics, along the equator of the world, was a torrid zone. And in between the poles and the tropics were temperate zones. Early modern Europeans understood from this theory that climate should be relatively constant along any given latitude, which is why they expected that the climate up in New France would be about the same as the climate in France. They predicted that in Quebec, the climate should be roughly the same as in Paris. Although colonists expected, in theory, a climate the same in Canada as in France, in practice, they learned from experience, as you probably already know, that the climates were quite different in the two different places. And what struck them most forcefully about this difference was that winter was much colder and much longer in Canada. They had their explanations for why, and the first of these explanations, the first of the most common explanations, was that winds passed over snowy mountains to bring the cold air. Their second favorite explanation was that Canada was covered with extensive forests. There was not much they could do about the direction of winds or the snowy mountains, but they did think they could do something about the forests. They noted that even back in France, snow lasted longer in a forest than on open ground once the spring sunshine became stronger. And they thought, therefore, if they cleared more of the forests in North America, they could lessen the cold of winter. This idea had imperial implications. It meant if the settlers cut down enough trees, they believed they could make the climate of Canada more like that of France. They could turn New France really more into something like Old France. They weren't there yet, though, and while they awaited a climate change, some French settlers also tried to make the case that winters were not really that bad. They tried to make the case that the cold was bearable, even beneficial. Pierre Boucher, who was the governor of Trois-Rivières, wrote in this book that yes, snow covered the land and the cold was a bit bitter for at least 5 months each year, but he said it was not entirely disagreeable. Most days, according to Boucher, were beautiful and serene, and people walked around with the help of these new items of clothing for the French called snowshoes. In truth, he confided, the snows here are less troublesome than are the muds in France. Barbale and her family would have heard something of Canada's winters before setting out from France. And I bring up this discussion of climate because it has similarities to French settlers' discussions of witches and demons. In the same way that they believed there was just one system of climate around the world, meaning they could transport their understanding of climate from Europe to North America, so they also believed that there was one system of supernatural power. They would find in North America the same witches and demons that they believed they had in Europe. Barbale when she arrived, went to work as a domestic servant here at the Seigneurie of Beauport, about 6 kilometers away from Quebec. When Ale worked there, the estate included a manor house, a watermill, a windmill, and a strong house for storage and protection in case of attack. None of these structures survives today, but this engraving and this photograph from the 19th century show us something of what the manor house looked like before it was destroyed by fire. Nothing about Barbalet's duties as a servant or her place of employment seemed unusual to anyone when she arrived. But soon she claimed to encounter terrifying demons and specters. Priests came from the town of Quebec to perform exorcisms, but their efforts did not work. And that is when people reported hearing the phantasmal music and seeing the flying stones. When we look at the witnesses' reports of what was happening, we can see that they were shaped both by assumptions brought over from France and also by the very local conditions in and around Quebec. One of the assumptions that they brought with them from France was about who would be most susceptible to demonic possession. Because of her gender and her age, Barbalet fit with these assumptions. Most people who were thought to be demonically possessed in early modern Europe were women and children. Observers during the 17th century were aware of this pattern. Physicians and theologians, who were all adult men, explained it by saying that women and children were more fragile and therefore more susceptible to spiritual interference. If you are suspicious about this conclusion, you'll hear in a little bit what historians think today. Another assumption brought from France was about who caused demonic attacks and why. Barbe Allais said that the demons were being sent by Daniel Vuille, the miller at Beauport. According to one account, the specific incident that prompted Vril to launch the demonic attack was that he wanted to marry Barbe Allais and said she had been promised to him. But because he was a man of bad customs, no one listened. He then became so angry that, and I quote, to avenge himself for this refusal, he wanted to have by his ill will what he had not been able to obtain by the right path. Unquote. This motivation would have been credible to French people who believed that witches were motivated by spite. They were especially motivated when taken over by envy because they had been denied something they desired. Here, Daniel Vril desired to marry Barbe Allais and was denied. Spite and ill will ensued. Yet another factor that would have contributed to suspicion on Vril was his religious identity. French leaders planning for New France to become, in their minds, a perfect society of citizens destined for heaven built Catholicism into the political construction of their colony. They used religion to distinguish this colony from those of Protestant countries such as England or the Netherlands, and they also used religion to justify incursions into indigenous territories, according to them, in order to save souls. The charter of the Company of New France from 1627 called for the peopling of the colony exclusively with French Catholics. Article 17 of this charter explained that descendants of the French living in New France, along with indigenous people who professed Catholicism, would be counted as French naturals. They would have all the same rights to citizenship as any other French subject. Being Catholic, therefore, was an important part of the identity of New France. But before coming to Canada, Daniel Vril was not Catholic. He had been Protestant. So Vril was a suspicious character. The response that the French settlers in Canada had to accusations against him were influenced not only by the assumptions they brought from France, but also by two conditions very specific to this particular place and time, to the region of Quebec in the early 1660s. The first condition was the demographics of French settlement, which lent greater significance to a broken promise of marriage. By law, in France at this time, marriages were based on a free exchange of vows. By the mid 17th century, a marriage of minors also needed parental consent, and every marriage needed the presence of witnesses at the wedding. We know that Barbalet's ability to choose her own spouse would have grown as she grew older. As she increased in age, she would have had more say in whom to marry. For us, though, a challenge is her age is difficult to determine with precision. Depending on what sources we use, we find that she was somewhere between the ages of 11 and 15 when she arrived in Canada. If we give most weight to the sources that we think are most reliable in recording age, we find she was probably between 12 and 14. That would have put her at the very low end of the range of age for first marriage in 17th century New France. This age would have meant Barbalet was legally able to contract a marriage, and she would have been legally able to withdraw from the agreement before the wedding if she chose. But the demographic situation in New France would have added more pressure to Allais to follow through with any promise of marriage. The French population in all of New France had reached only about 1,700 people by this time. And as we have seen, its largest settlement at Quebec housed only 800 of them. The French crown tried to attract more migrants, but it wasn't having much success, especially among women. For French settlers as a group, there were 6 or 7 marriageable men for every marriageable woman. When looking at just young adults, people aged between 16 and 30, the difference was even greater. There were more than 12 unmarried French men for every unmarried French woman. You might be expecting that with such an imbalance in the marriage market, so to say, women would have had a lot of choice in their partners, and they did. But aside from those who took religious vows, from those who made the decision to become a nun, women didn't really have the choice simply of not marrying at all. Marriage was expected. If Barbalet had wanted to delay or avoid marriage, there was no easy way for her to do that, especially if she'd made a promise to marry or if her parents had made that promise on her behalf. Being possessed by demons, however, shielded her. We heard a little earlier that people in the 17th century from Europe thought women and children were more likely to be possessed because they were more feeble. Historians today propose a somewhat different explanation. Historians today note that women and children as groups were considered subordinate in the social hierarchy of early modern Europe. Women were expected to submit to control by men, whether husbands or fathers, and children were expected to submit to control by parents and other elders. Demonic possession interfered with this hierarchy. According to early modern demonologists, the speech and actions of a possessed person were directed by the demon, not by the person whose body the demon was inhabiting. Therefore, if a person said or did things while possessed, early modern demonologists interpreted this as being the demon saying and doing things. Such an interpretation gave the possessed person a kind of paradoxical power. They were thought to lose their own will to speak and act, but they gained the ability to say and do things in a world without being responsible for them. We don't know, and we likely cannot know, if Barbale faked her possession or really thought she was possessed. But we do know that the pressures for young women to marry in New France during the early 1660s would have made it seem plausible to those around her that a man of bad customs would have pressured her into an agreement of marriage and then would have grown angry when she or someone from her family reneged on the agreement. The second local condition that would have influenced people's interpretation of reports from Beauport is somewhat connected to the first. The French colony was insecure. Not many French people lived there, and indigenous people were not assimilating to French ways as some back in France had arrogantly presumed they would. The colonial project of New France was precarious, and the colonists knew it. They wrote in a particularly anxious tone about attacks by the five nations of the Haudenosaunee, called the Iroquois by the French. Warfare between the Iroquois and the French had erupted again in 1660, and the settlers were scared about what would happen next. To be fair, the French did not fully understand the complex international relations of the Haudenosaunee, but they did know they were vulnerable to attack, especially when cut off from communication with France because of ice in the river for months each year. There were rumors of invasions and a sense that the French settlers were not ready to fend one off. They asked for reinforcements, and they carved narrow slits into the walls of their convents through which projectiles could be fired. They were facing uncertainties about the future of the colony at the very time when there arose a suspicion of enemies from within, using witchcraft to launch an assault of supernatural forces against them. Daniel Ruil, the miller suspected of witchcraft, was put in prison, and then he was executed. This much we know. Historians have disagreed, though, about exactly how and why he was executed. Some think he was hanged and others that he was shot. Some conclude that the crime for which he was executed was illegal trade in alcohol, while others conclude it was some kind of religious infraction. These disagreements have arisen because historians are using different sources, and in some cases, because they're using different editions of the same source. Several sources report Ruil's execution. I think the one that is most helpful in establishing how and why the execution took place is this entry from the Journal of the Jesuits. Compared to other sources, this one was written closest in time to the event, which gives it an immediacy in time. And the intent of this source was for record keeping internal to the Jesuit order, not for wider circulation, which gives the source a different kind of immediacy because it was not edited for publication. This entry from the Journal of the Jesuits says that Ruil was hanged, or rather shot, as if the scribe were correcting himself partway through writing the information down. The means of death here seems pretty clear. It was being shot with a musket. The same source leaves us somewhat ambiguous, though, about why Ruil was executed. Someone was whipped, we're told, for having traded liquor. And the writing in the margin would seem to suggest up here that there were multiple executions because of the trade. There's a little s at the end of the word exécution, executions in the plural. However, this marginal annotation was written by a different person. It's a different handwriting. So perhaps we should not give it too much weight as what the main scribe intended. An earlier entry from the same source, the Journal of the Jesuits, reports why Ruil was imprisoned in the first place months earlier. And that was because he was a relapsed heretic, Protestant is what they would mean here, a blasphemer and a profaner of the sacraments. It's possible that the crime for which Vril was imprisoned was not the same crime for which he was executed. So we should consider why the authorities might have wanted Vril imprisoned in the first place. The authorities running the colony were in disagreement, and two of them especially did not get along. The Journal of the Jesuits puts it this way, that there was a great quarrel between the governor, Pierre de Voyer d'Argenson, and the bishop, François de Laval. And this great quarrel was about the sentence passed against Vril. These two leaders in Quebec were both from noble families. They were both recently arrived in Canada, and they were both accustomed to getting their way. Voyer d'Argenson, as governor, was the king's representative and the highest ranking official in New France. Laval's position was less well defined. His official role in Canada at this time was as vicar apostolic, which meant he was responsible for spiritual care of people in a region that had not yet been organized into a diocese by the church. A diocese was the region overseen by a bishop. The position of vicar apostolic was largely unknown in France and rather confusing. It is true that Quebec was not yet in a diocese. It was officially under the authority of the Archbishop of Rouen back in France. At least it was sort of under this authority, but Rouen was very far away. The French king tried to solve the problem by making Laval a bishop of something while they waited for Quebec to be organized into a diocese. So he made Laval a bishop, but not a bishop of Quebec. The king made Laval a bishop of Petra, which was in Palestine. So Laval technically was a bishop, but not exactly a bishop of Canada. The governor and the bishop squabbled about a lot. They squabbled about where the benches of each should be placed in a church. They squabbled about who should kneel on which cushion. They squabbled about who should be saluted first by school children, and more. Such disagreements probably seem petty to modern people, but public acknowledgement of precedence mattered to 17th century Frenchmen, especially these Frenchmen who were accustomed to getting what they wanted and whose official positions were still somewhat unclear. They were jostling for status in a highly hierarchical society. The power struggle between governor and bishop magnified the significance of Daniel Vril's misdeeds, whatever those misdeeds were. Laval compiled a set of documents touching on the dispute between him and the governor. This dossier included a section about a certain girl infested with demons and who for more than a year continues to be tormented. Among the documents in this section were some about the diabolical infestation, about how it was recognized, about the innocence of Ale, and proofs against Vril. The dossier also included documents about the judicial process, such as an appeal to the governor's refusal, and another appeal. We know about these documents from this inventory. The inventory does not say where the documents were sent, and the documents themselves have not yet been found. What is nonetheless clear, just from this inventory alone, is that with this dossier, Laval was trying to build a case of witchcraft against Vril. Moreover, he was trying to establish that he was the one responsible for the prosecution. Laval's plan did not work at first. But in the summer of 1661, the governor Voyer d'Argenson requested that he be returned to France because, he said, of his infirmities. People at the time wondered if he was really pushed out because of complaints in Quebec. In any case, Voyer d'Argenson left, and his replacement pronounced a sentence of death against Vril. Laval, in the end, got his way. Meanwhile, Barbalet was brought into a hospital. the Hôtel Dieu in the upper town of Quebec, the same location where the Hôtel Dieu can still be found today. A hospital may seem unsuitable at first as a place to care for someone thought to be demonically possessed. But the nuns at this hospital considered their duties to include care for the body and also care for the soul. Their care for Ale drew from medical traditions back in France, but also from the hospital's earlier years in North America when it was part of missionary efforts to convert indigenous people. When Ale arrived, the hospital had a newly built room for the sick, and this room sounds like really quite a pleasant place to rest and recuperate. The room was illuminated by light that came in through windows opening onto an interior courtyard, as well as windows facing south. This is not, however, where Barbale went. She was put into a little room next to the parlor. An Ursuline nun reported that at night, Ale was still being agitated by a demon, although during the day, she helped to care for the sick. Her main protector at the hospital was the hospitalière nun, Catherine de Saint Augustin. Catherine's confessor said he had once seen Catherine's arm black as ink from the hits of demons. This confessor, also her biographer, the Jesuit priest Paul Ragueneau, said that the demons were enraged against Catherine because she was trying to tear Ale away from them. A nurse's battle against evil supernatural forces was probably not so surprising to people in the 17th century as it may be now. A French Hôtel Dieu was supposed to care for people's material as well as spiritual needs. And this Hôtel Dieu had yet another layer in its institutional history that shaped how Catherine de Saint Augustin cared for her patient's soul and how her biographer, Paul Ragueneau, wrote about it. This other layer was the Hôtel Dieu's early years as a missionary institution. As the royal letters establishing the hospital put it, it was, and I quote, a means of attracting the wild peoples and infidels of New France to the true religion, unquote. What these letters meant was that the hospital was supposed to help bring Catholicism to Indigenous people. When the hospital nuns first came to Canada, they didn't go to the upper town of Quebec. They set up the hospital as part of a Jesuit mission in Sillery, which is a location a few kilometers upriver from the town of Quebec. This mission was administered by the Jesuits to gather people together from different Indigenous nations and make them learn how to be farming Christians. The hospital here was supposed to help with conversions by attracting people to receive health care, especially in the midst of epidemics. And while the patients were in the hospital, the nuns were supposed to teach them about Catholicism. However, the settlement at Sillery did not develop exactly as the founders had hoped. The indigenous inhabitants maintained a great deal of independence. The missionaries were forced to make compromises, and in 1644 the hospital was moved out of this mission into the town of Quebec, out of fear that its placement at Sillery made it too vulnerable to attack by the Iroquois. The original goals of the missionary foundation were mostly unmet. The legacy of these goals, as well as the disappointment in not achieving them, moved with the hospital into town. Catherine de Saint Augustin, nurse at the hospital once it was back in the town of Quebec, thought she had an apostolic mission in Canada. And for her, this mission included battling demons. According to her biographer, Catherine took on these demons willingly, even saying she was happy for them to remain in her body if it was agreeable to God. Far from possessing her, according to Ragueneau, the demons were captured within her. Such a captivity was difficult for Catherine, since it inspired in her heart a rage against God and drew her towards impurity, but her biographer insists she remained in control. Furthermore, Ragueneau was confident that Catherine's interactions with the demons was actually a mark of holiness. It was something permitted by God to prove her virtue. Here you can see the frontispiece to Ragueneau's biography, which shows a demon here being stomped upon by an angel speaking with Catherine de Saint Augustin. And part of the text underneath says that she is victorious over demons. Writers in New France who thought they needed to defend the role of the church there. These writers could harness Catherine's battles against demons into a larger story about Catholic mission in Canada. The mission at Sillery had not accomplished what the Jesuits intended. Other missionary endeavors were struggling or collapsing too. But here, in this hospital, was a nun who described herself as nailed to the cross of Canada. Her ongoing battles with demons could show that New France was important enough on a cosmic scale for evil forces to amass against it. And it had missionary defenders still brave enough to sacrifice themselves to save the colony. Or at least that's what this biography implied. However hard Catherine de Saint Augustin worked to protect the people under her care, though, Barbalet was still not freed from her demonic tormentors. Barbalet returned to her job as servant at Beauport. There, it was Marie Regnoir, lady of the estate, who finally delivered Halle from the demonic torments. Regnoir provided a vivid, exciting account of her efforts, and this account survives in 3 copies. Here is a copy which is conserved at the archive of the Hôtel Dieu Hospital. It was the first one signed by Regnoir. The other 2, conserved in the archive of the Jesuits, were signed a few weeks later. They're identical in most respects, barring some changes to spelling and an additional section that I'll talk about in a bit. Regnoir's account tells us that on or about the 15th of October, 1662, so for those interested, the anniversary is coming up, on the 15th of October, 1662, between 10 and 11 at night, Barbalet was sleeping when a demon came to torment her, as was the demon's custom. Regnoir got out of bed to help, as she was accustomed to do. This night, the demonic torment was worse than Regnoir had ever seen it before. It came into her mind to put onto Halle a rib bone from a deceased Jesuit priest, Jean de Brébeuf, which Paul Ragueneau had given to her. As an aside, you will probably remember Paul Ragueneau as the author of the biography of Catherine de Saint Augustin. He had been a friend and close associate of Brébeuf. Here is how Regnoir's report described what happened next. Regnoir placed this rib bone against the side of Halle, and immediately the demon became agitated, causing Halle to contort her arms and her legs and her whole body. The demon told Regnoir to remove the bone because it burned. Regnoir conjured the demon and demanded he tell her the name of the person whose relics she was using. They argued. The demon said he would not answer, and Regnoir responded she would not remove the relic until he did. The demon said it was a relic from a saint martyred among the Huron by the Iroquois, which from the French perspective is a correct answer. Regnoir demanded that the demon tell her the name of the saint. They argued some more. Regnoir said she would not remove the relic unless he consented to leave the girl. The demon refused, saying the girl was his. Regnoir responded forcefully, saying, "You have lied, damned spirit that you are. You have nothing. She is mine. Our good God and her father and her mother gave her to me." Regnoir placed the bone against the side of Halle's body at the place of her heart. The demon's cries turned languid, saying over and over again, "Remove this from me, woman, because I cannot bear it. remove it quickly. I cannot bear it. I am burnt. Renoir conjured the demon as before, this time also adding that she was conjuring by the merits of the saint whose relics she was using, and she ordered the demon to depart. Finally, this seems to have worked. Renoir saw something she described like a breath leaving from the mouth of Allais. Allais then began to speak the names of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph and to make the sign of a cross. Such speech and actions signified to readers of this report the departure of the possessing demon and Allais's return of control over her own body. The deliverance, therefore, was almost complete. The document goes on to report that Allais said the demon had left, but now two witches who had been accompanying the demon were at the foot of the bed. Renoir conjured them as well and told them to leave. The witches spoke back, but Renoir, unable to distinguish the words, could hear only a low buzzing or hum. Allais relayed the words themselves. The witches had come to bring her to a Sabbath. But, as one of the manuscript copies concludes rather abruptly, since that day the girl had neither seen nor heard either demon or witch, and she was of a freer mind than she had been for 2.5 years. The other two manuscript copies have an additional brief section that continues the account in the third person, saying that 4.5 months after this deliverance, Allais met another man suspected of witchcraft. He tried to put her on a cart that he was driving and said impertinent things to her. I wish it told us what the impertinent things were, but we are not given that information. She resisted and was tormented by demons again for 11 days. But then people prayed to Brébeuf once more, asking for a second recovery, and Allais had since then remained entirely delivered. We see in this account that Renoir treated Allais as possessed. Renoir clearly differentiated the person of Allais from the demon within her body. Her account asserts that it was the demon causing Allais to contort her limbs and the demon speaking through her mouth. Moreover, at the level of grammar, when the demon spoke from within Allais's body, it used masculine grammatical forms. Whereas once Allais was thought to be speaking for herself again, she used feminine grammatical forms. Casting out this demon was not easy, but Renoir's actions and words show that she was determined and confident and assertive as she commanded her supernatural adversary. Perhaps less obvious is the account's delicacy in naming exactly what Renoir was doing. The account characterizes Renoir's actions as a deliverance, a relief, and a healing. These are labels that convey very wholesome ideas of removing harmful forces, of easing pain and restoring health. If we look beyond these labels to the procedures being described, we might be struck by a conspicuous resemblance to something else, an exorcism. Why did Renoir's account not call the procedure that? Renoir's gender and lay status rendered her officially unsuitable to perform the ritual. By the 17th century, only male clerics, priests, were granted institutional authority to perform exorcisms. So this might explain why these actions were not called an exorcism. But we are left with perhaps an even more interesting question. Why did Renoir perform these actions at all if they were an exorcism in all but name? The actions were hardly secret. We have 3 copies of the account, and the second section says people had read the first section before the second section was written. Well, Renoir was a person of high social status in the colony. She was almost 60 years old by this point. She had been friends with the founder Samuel de Champlain decades earlier. Her husband was a medical professional, and one of her daughters was a nun in the hospital. So, she was powerful, she was expected to look after people under her care, and she had proximity to medical training. Something else to note is that this account is very careful to insist that the power to liberate Allais from the demons were not in the hands of Renoir, but rather through the relics of Jean de Brébeuf. Brébeuf was supposed to be the real hero of this tale. The most prominent champion of Brébeuf's post-mortem power was Paul Ragueneau, the one who gave the rib bone to Marie Renoir. Barbalet was delivered from demons, and her life continued. Very briefly, the course of her life after the deliverance is remarkably unremarkable. She returned to the town of Quebec to work as a servant, first in the household of a merchant and next in the Hôtel Dieu hospital. Then she married Jean Carrier, who had also been working as a servant in the hospital. What you see here is a detail from their marriage contract, and it contains the only writing we have from Barbalet's own hand, this mark that she left in the place of a signature. Barbalet and Jean Carrier moved across the river and settled on a farm where they raised several children. No mass possessions or witch hunts followed, which might seem surprising given all of the attention this received. So how do we account for this being an isolated case? Well, first, there were changes to the security of New France. Some aspects of the colony were turning out quite differently from what the early planners had intended, but the colony grew and prospered. We can see from this plan that there were new buildings in the town, including a market, a brewery, and a tannery. Within the town itself, we can see that there were many farms on the ground on both sides of the river and large ships making their way along the St. Lawrence River, firing their cannons at nothing in particular. New France was becoming more politically and economically secure. Colonists did continue to believe that witches and demons stalked their lives. So we need another explanation for why there were no mass trials or possessions. The general pattern can be explained by the populace willing to believe in magic, but an elite largely uninterested in prosecuting their crime. Discussions of demonology were being characterized more and more by doubt. There were still some ideas of witchcraft and demonic power swirling around in French colonial culture, but the elites no longer feared the dangers of witches and demons as they had done a few generations earlier. As the years went by, diabolical forces drifted further and further from people's concerns, and they became tamed into entertaining tales that could be told on long winter nights. It's true that the devil makes frequent appearances in Quebecois and French Canadian folklore, but usually the devil appears as a force from the past rather than the present, and a figure more to be outwitted than feared. In the most famous of the legends of the devil in Quebec folklore, well, in French Canadian folklore more broadly, there is this, the chasse galerie, shown here on the can and the bottle of a Quebec beer. In this tale, a group of drunk lumbermen yearning for female company one New Year's Eve decide to offer their souls to the devil in return for passage aboard an enchanted canoe. One of them says he is willing to risk the salvation of my soul for the fun of going to a New Year's Eve to kiss my blonde. Among the terms of the pact is that if the travelers mention the name of God or touch the cross on any church's steeple while flying on the canoe, the devil will win their soul. In most versions, the lumbermen escape the devil's grasp. It's a good yarn, to be sure, but this devil's ambitions had certainly diminished a great deal since the early 17th century, when demons were thought to be overturning the entire colonial project of New France. Thank you for your attention, and I'd be glad now to hear your questions and comments.
That was wonderful. It's so nice to see an academic who's so enthusiastic about their subject and their work. How many years have you spent researching this, Mary?
Gosh, well, there are different ways to answer that question. I first came across the story in the summer of 2013, so almost 10 years. But I didn't jump into it right away. I was tying up some other projects. So in some ways, I suppose I've been researching this for almost 10 years. In some ways, I'm drawing upon skills I've been trying to hone for 30 years. And in some ways, I've really only been refining it in the past few.
There's a question in the chat about what questions you still have about bark.
Ah, I still
Unresolved.
have, have so many questions, and I feel I need to remain professionally agnostic about some of them, that there are some questions that I likely can't answer using just reason and the historical record. But I would love to find out more of what she thought through all of this. It's a real challenge to study somebody from the past who hasn't left us her own account. We have more words from the demon than we have from Barbale. So I'm hopeful to find out more in the future, but I think I've found all the sources that I can for now.
You told us in the beginning how you first heard about the story of Barbale. Um, Rena still wants to know more about what drew you there.
Well, I was drawn there really just from reading these letters and seeing this account and thinking, this is wild. What a great story. Surely everybody has written about it. And not many people had. So I was sincerely drawn into these other questions of what the story meant. How much could I find out about it? And what could this story tell me about the deeper themes of the social and religious history of colonial North America? So I guess the simple answer, Rena, is I was drawn from this one letter into the story, and I've been, to use a demonological term, kind of obsessed with it since.
Obsession is such a good word there. Do you feel like a detective, Mary?
A little bit, yeah. Historical detective. I wish I had, living suspects to put in front of me to interview, but historical work is detective work for sure, where we try to piece together the best understanding we have from the evidence that remains.
Yeah. People want to know about your sources, um, such as the register with the lost letters. How do you go about finding all this stuff?
Through the good graces of extremely helpful archivists and librarians for the most part.
Yay.
And yeah, yeah, your people are excellent people, and sources that will lead me to other sources. Sources are in conversation with one another, and so they will make reference to other sources that I know existed. So as a concrete example, I did much of this research was done in North America. Much were done in small institutional archives in Quebec, but some of this research was done in the Vatican, in what has until recently been called the Vatican Secret Archive, now the Vatican Apostolic Archive. And they have files on the canonization of Brébeuf, on Jean de Brébeuf being made a saint, which wasn't until the 20th century. And those files include testimony from people in early 20th century Quebec who still had a memory of some of these earlier events. So I could use those files to find where the documents might be in archives in North America now. And some of them had moved around. So I had to rely again on the generosity of archivists to point me in the right direction.
There's a question in the chat about witch hunts in Quebec. Is there a tradition of witch hunts in Quebec?
There's very little. And it's one of those areas of curiosity. Why weren't there more witch hunts in Quebec? There were a few isolated accusations. One person who was found guilty of witchcraft and his punishment was to be banished. He moved to another town. But there were no mass witch hunts. There was nothing like what we find in Salem, which calls out for some kind of explanation. And I'm not sure we've reached a really satisfying one yet, except that the population pressures were different, and maybe this demographic imbalance between men and women had something to do with it, because the French settlers who came over certainly had belief in witches.
Yes. Rosa asked about other stories in Quebec folklore. She mentions La Corriveau, but I'm thinking of black dogs and black cats too. Are you interested in exploring more of these stories?
Rosa, bonjour. Oui, merci, bien sûr. I would love to know more about these stories. I'm not a folklorist, and so my skills run out in some ways when I get to the more modern accounts. But yes, I am fascinated by these more recent accounts, and the werewolves too. The werewolves in Quebec are really kind of lovable, sympathetic creatures. So the black dogs, La Corriveau, the devil in more modern accounts. I would love to know more about these. So Rosa, if ever you want to collaborate, oh, please let me know.
This is the kind of question that I really loved. Is there anything in your research that surprised you?
Yes, this is from Nicole. Pretty much everything in this research has surprised me because when I came to it, I was not a specialist in the history of New France. I'd been researching medieval Scotland, and almost all of this was new to me, except a bit of the work on the Jesuits. I, as a tutorial assistant, at U of T. I'd done some work teaching Jesuit accounts. Pretty much everything else surprised me, including the wealth of surviving material. For the social history of an early modern people, New France is very well served by the richness of its records. So I'm continually surprised at how much we really can learn and how many big questions this opens our mind to seeing.
Do you have any tips on evaluating historical sources for credibility?
Oh, gosh, yes, many. Often we won't know for sure, and it's perfectly fine. In fact, it is wise to be somewhat conservative in our level of confidence. So if we only have a single historical source, if we have nothing to compare it against, we do our best with our reason and what seems consistent with evidence we have from elsewhere. If we have multiple sources, we try to compare them against one another and from there assess what is likely to be the most accurate presentation of the past. And as a third point, if we see in a historical source something we're pretty sure is untrue or at least inaccurate, note it, and we can study the inaccuracy. The source may not be an entirely reliable presenter of daily life as we would understand it, but if it's inaccurate, it tells us something about what people thought.
Clearly, you learn from inaccuracy as well, yes.
Exactly.
I'm going to read this question out. You mentioned that microhistory can help us understand aspects of larger questions. Are there larger historical questions that this microhistory sheds light on that you didn't mention in your talk?
I think the main one, maybe the biggest one that I didn't mention enough in my talk is how precarious the colony was. When I was reading this letter from the Ursuline nun from 21st century Quebec City, it was obvious the colony had survived. But that was built on a lot of contingencies that depended on support from Indigenous peoples, that depended on more support from France. And the colonists knew at the time they couldn't count on it. So I was not aware of how sharply the French colonists in the mid 17th century feared that the whole project was going to fall apart. They knew the fissures in colonial ideology in some ways better than we do now. So that is maybe the biggest theme that comes out of this, at least to me.
Yeah. There's a question about the fact that this is such a little studied topic as a microhistory. How Arnold is asking, how do you deal with that? Like how you're really the original researcher in this, right?
Some of it. Hi, Arnold, nice to see you again, student at UTM. Uh, I, I'm not the only original researcher in this. I'm the first person to do a book-length, context-rich study of it. There are other historians who have looked at most of these sources before I did, so I can build upon their understanding. But I've tried to be really honest and really upfront about how much we don't know and how much I still don't know, where the limits of my understanding and my confidence lie. So I do my best to assemble as many of the primary sources as I can. And then I use other historians' excellent scholarship to understand them as responsibly as we are able.
Spencer has a question about accessing the slideshow information after this. And we do record these talks so that it will be available that way. I don't know if you would share it in any other way, Professor?
I would welcome emails from anybody. You can find me at from my webpage at UTM, and I can certainly send you the information. I'm not sure if I can distribute the entire slideshow, and it's not because of my material within it. It's because some of the images have copyrights held by libraries and archives. And so I'm allowed to use them as part of this kind of academic presentation, but I'm not sure I can distribute them. So if Spencer wants to know anything specific, by all means, email me and I'll share whatever I can.
And I'm also going to lead him to the book that's coming out on October 15th. This is a fascinating story, and there's much more information in that book, many more pages to be read about it. So look for the book. And a last question has just come in. Dario says, Professor, I just realized that this is the second well-documented case of a French woman that I have encountered, the first being Hermine de Rheims, in the 14th century.
I remember her well. Hello, Dario, another UTM student. Yep, the French sources are pretty good for this kind of exploration. So if anybody is interested in learning more about what people believed in demons and witches and contingencies and how they dealt with uncertainties in their own life, I've noticed that France and New France are pretty good venues to explore those questions.
Yes, this has been fascinating. We're coming to the end of our time now. And sorry, there are so many thanks in the chat line, Mary. You
Oh,
could read them all. But this does bring us to the end of our presentation tonight. We do value feedback on all our programs and services at the library. You can fill out a survey or follow the link that Elizabeth will put in the chat box, or you can scan the QR code with your phone. Good night, everybody. Thank you for coming.
thank you very much, everyone.